Good afternoon, everyone. We will begin in just a few moments. Welcome, everyone. We will begin in just a few moments. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CRES Forum's event for today, Natural Climate Solutions, Reducing Emissions and Sequestering Carbon from Farm to Coastline. Just a few brief housekeeping notes before we begin. My name is Rebecca Lorenzen. I am Policy Manager with CRES Forum. As attendees, you are muted. However, we do encourage your participation on the Q&A function, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, please message me in the chat. And we do encourage you to participate on social media. Our Twitter handle is CRES Forum. Without further ado, I will hand this over to Charles Hernick, our Vice President for Policy and Advocacy.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to everyone for joining us here. We want to get started on time as folks roll in. One programming note at the top is that Rita Height with the American Forest Foundation won't be able to join us today. Instead, we have Natalie Alex. Amazingly, Rita got called into jury duty, and so we're very thankful to the American Forest Foundation for making a quick substitution, and very excited to have Natalie join us here. But thanks to Rebecca for opening this. My name is Charles Hernick, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, and very excited for today's event to focus on natural climate solutions. It's been in the news. And for me, as someone who grew up in Minnesota, studied ecology, worked on farms and in and around, forested areas, and have for all of my life really looked at the environment in terms of ecosystems and ecosystem services. This is really an amazing time where we're looking at real legislation on Capitol Hill that stands a chance of passing. And we wanted to have a little bit of time set aside here during this hour to talk through what this opportunity means. What are the relative strengths associated with what's happening, and how can we learn more and dig in a little bit deeper and have a better understanding of what we are actually talking about when it comes to natural climate solutions. Folks over the past 2 years have heard more about Trillion Trees efforts to plant trees, reforest, and help sequester carbon dioxide by pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. Growing Climate Solutions Act is, for those of you who follow CRES Forum closely, you know that this is an important piece of legislation that we've looked at and have aimed to build support for. And it's very, impressive in my mind that there are 49 co-sponsors on the bill, half Republicans, half Democrats, and that this is an important area where we're likely to see growth. And the growth that I'm talking about has to do not just with carbon offsets, but better land management practices in general. I view and have always viewed, farmers and foresters as those folks that are managing ecosystems, but they're managing for a certain output or a certain outcome, crop yield. They might be managing or have recently changed practices to better manage water that's running off, from their particular lands. And a lot of that has been important for Chesapeake Bay restoration, for example. So there's no shortage of opportunities and reasons that folks have been looking at our lands, the amber waves of grain, to better manage the resources that we have in this country. But I want to take a firm focus and look at carbon in particular. Just yesterday, Bloomberg Green had their newsletter, and they looked at carbon, and the report was that the Bank of England is estimating that the market for carbon offsets will be something in the order of $100 billion by the end of the decade. That's a staggering number considering where things were just a couple of years ago, and their graphic has this amazing exponential growth curve. And part of CRES's reason for supporting Growing Climate Solutions is that we want to be able to help deal farmers into that process and create opportunity for family foresters and whatnot. So we're going to start at the beginning. I have an expert panel that is joining me here. Bill Northey, principal at WH Northey and former USDA Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation. Thank you, Bill, for joining us. Natalie Alex, who's the policy manager, as I mentioned, at American Forest Foundation. And then Rick Ebert, who's the president of the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, will be providing some comments here on where this all started, and then some additional visibility onto where we are going. Agriculture is responsible for something like 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's going to be opportunities to offset or sequester on that land. But just looking at land management in general, if we optimized America's lands for carbon, the opportunity is something like 20%. We could offset 20% of all U.S. emissions just by better land management practices. Now, that may not be desirable in all circumstances, but it's at least important to understand, the opportunity. So what I'd like to do next is do a round robin where I'll introduce each of our panelists, give you an opportunity to, introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how you got started in this space. So take 4 minutes, 5 minutes to introduce yourself and your organization, and I'll prompt you each with a question here. Bill, I'll start off with you because you've worn several hats over your career, both in Iowa and in Washington, D.C., focusing on conservation, sustainability, and climate change now. How has that dialogue evolved for you and the farmers that you've worked with over the past years? How has that discussion evolved, and what are folks talking about right now?
Well, Charles, certainly appreciate the chance to be on with the panel and look forward to the questions, and it really has evolved. One of my favorite activities as Secretary of Ag in Iowa was handing out what we called Century Farm Awards or Heritage Farm Awards. That's awards to families that have been farming for 100 or 150 years. Now, to Rick, that doesn't sound like a lot of time, but to an Iowa farmer, that's a long time. And it's certainly generations. And invariably, as we'd hand those out, we'd have a conversation about how their farms had changed. Every now and then we'd come across somebody whose family was the original kind of farmers of that, but many of them, of course, were after, and most of the time farming started with horses and things have evolved. Many of them, we would also talk even about how it changed while they were farming. So we had a lot of focus on water quality. We saw big growth in cover crops and no-till in Iowa, trying to reduce the amount of phosphorus and nitrate that were lost off the farm. Many of these practices that we talk about for carbon have co-benefits with water quality. They're not all the same. They shouldn't be all done in the same place. And invariably, even when we had farms that were next door to each other, those farms were different. So I think the idea here that solutions aren't universal, solutions are unique to farms. We need more solutions, and these farmers will change if they have opportunities, and we develop the science through good science out there. We understand a little bit more about soil quality. We build some real characteristics and more productivity in that soil as we build carbon as well. And now we have folks that are interested in it. And to be able to have USDA focus on it, to be able to have some markets that provide some incentives. We know that we may see carbon markets where we're selling carbon, but we also may see, supply chain demand that says, I want low carbon corn. And so we don't know how that all play out. And I think government needs to find a way of being supportive about making sure ag is part of that solution, but also letting the private industry also develop to figure out what do our customers want, what do the consumers want, what do the businesses that we sell our crops to want, and what kind of new technologies can we get? There's biologicals and others out there that'll give us some new technologies to be able to address some concerns that we didn't have a few years ago, but we now have and want to focus on.
Thanks, Bill. It's a very helpful introduction, and the word that you use that we'll come back to is co-benefits in terms of what is being produced on the farm and that nexus between water, carbon, soil. We'll focus more on that, but before that, I'd like to introduce Rick Ebert, President of Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, and I will add that we'll put all of the speaker bios into the chat so folks can take a look at more of the qualifications here. But Rick, please do introduce yourself and your organization. Everybody knows Pennsylvania agriculture, especially if you're dialed into this team's event from the Mid-Atlantic. My view is that every farmer's market defines local, or every restaurant here in DC defines local as whatever is being brought from Pennsylvania. And so it's everyone knows the good produce and good meats that are coming from Pennsylvania. But it also puts you at the center of the debate in terms of what the real opportunity looks like. Scale is something that is important in agriculture, but also when we're talking about carbon. How are some of the natural solutions being viewed on the farm in Pennsylvania, considering where you all have been, as Bill mentioned, for many hundreds of years in terms of the farming that's being done in Pennsylvania? And one thing that I think of in particular is I know all the work that's gone into Chesapeake Bay restoration. I live in Annapolis, so downstream from many of your farmers. If you could talk a little bit about what's been done in the past and how that changes the posture of what folks are looking at into the future, that'd be helpful.
Okay, all right, thanks, George. Really appreciate being part of this panel too today. I'm looking forward to the conversation and the questions. I am Rick Ebert, President of the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, but most importantly, I've been a dairyman for over 38 years. I'm really third generation. I got the fourth generation on the farm right now. We're diversifying from what we've been. We've been dairy for all those years with my brother and my dad before that. But Pennsylvania, like I said, is very unique. That we are a very diverse state, and that's what makes Pennsylvania Farm Bureau sort of unique. Also, is we're a grassroots organization. All of our policy initiatives start at the local level with individual farmers presenting solutions for issues and concerns out there for the ag community. So anything that we put forward for policy development or lobbying efforts begins with at the local level. So it's real time answers and to solutions to the agriculture community. We are the largest organization, general farm organization in Pennsylvania, and actually part of American Farm Bureau, which is the largest general farm organization also. So I know Bill and Natalie probably have seen a lot of what Farm Bureau does across the nation. But we also have our, promotion and education part of the organization that, talks about agriculture in general, tries to dispel myths, sort of teach the general consumer, the what, why, and how we do things on the farm and producing food and making sure it's good and wholesome and reaches that consumer level like you said, Charles, about, everything comes from Pennsylvania is local, which, is a nice benefit for Pennsylvania because we're so close to the population. When we start talking about, the carbon markets and that, I'd have to say, the Northeast and Pennsylvania really has been at the forefront of, sequestering carbon even before we realized that. We've been dealing with the Chesapeake Bay model for quite a number of years, so we've got a lot of conservation practices already in place. And as we learn about new technology and what we're doing, the carbon market's sort of an added benefit that we've been doing. I've been no-tilling for over 30 years. I've been doing cover cropping for quite a number of years also, as time and resources allow. And we were doing that to, preserve our soils, protect our waters. But now we're learning, that it is part of the carbon market. So a lot of the Northeast has been, early adopters, and that's going to be part of the conversation is, how do we benefit from what's going on now? Our size of farm's a lot smaller than you take, Iowa or Nebraska or Illinois when you're talking thousands of acres. But I think we can be a part of the solution and part of the opportunity. I know you had mentioned that, carbon emissions are probably 10% for agriculture, but I think it's been shown that, Pennsylvania is only a 3% emitter just because of all the work we're actually doing already. And as we begin, talking about these carbon markets and, as technology evolves from it, we look forward to benefiting from it. So again, thank you for the opportunity here today.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Rick. That's really helpful. And, your focus on really understanding what is going to benefit a smaller family farmer or really benefit at the local level does matter. And I think that your statement that Pennsylvania, having been such an earlier adopter of so many best practices, has a different baseline than a lot of other parts of the country, and that is going to be something that we'll need to factor in, and I hope that we can talk about more. But before we get there, I do want to pass the microphone over to Natalie. Natalie, thank you for joining us here. American Forest Foundation it puts a priority and emphasis on family forests, and I think to Rick's point just a minute ago, we need to think big scale but small scale too. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that in terms of the work that your organization has done as it relates to climate change. So if you could introduce yourself and American Forest Foundation and talk a little bit about that climate nexus, that'd be great.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me, Charles. My name is Natalie Alex, and I am the policy manager for the American Forest Foundation. And for those of you who are not familiar, the American Forest Foundation works with a specific segment of rural America that crosses over with the farmer community, which are family and private forest owners. Our work at AFF concentrates on delivering meaningful conservation impact by empowering these family forest owners across the US. So this also includes empowering family forest owners to help address climate change. US forests and forest products currently offset 15% of our country's annual carbon emissions, representing our single largest natural carbon sink. And more importantly, studies suggest that this could be nearly doubled with the right actions. An analysis from the Nature Conservancy shows that natural climate solutions hold the potential for 37% of needed mitigation globally through 2030. So there's great potential in our forests, but we need to find the best solutions to tap into this potential. And for us at AFF, we feel that a meaningful place to start is with the largest ownership group of forests. Families and individuals collectively own the largest portion, or 36% of all forests. And this is more than the federal government or corporations. So if we were to tap into the forests to help address our climate, family and private owners must be included. And even more, family forest owners care about the environment and want to do what's right by the land today and for the future. They want to actively care for it and help improve forest health. But what's prevented them from doing so this far is having the right expertise needed to do the work, and most of all, the high upfront cost of forest management. But this is where carbon markets can help. Markets, specifically carbon markets, can help family forest owners by providing them an avenue to generate income from their land. They also complement other government tools, such as tax incentives and leverage private side investment to help achieve scale across the country. Carbon markets also appeal to landowners because they offer a voluntary option for actions. Additionally, the demand for carbon markets is exploding. Some models actually predict as much as a 5.6 billion with a B in demand in the next few years. That's private dollars that could be funneled to rural economies if markets are open to these small family forest owners. So our work at AFF is helping developing these carbon markets, specifically for small private forest owners, so that we can better utilize our forests now as we work towards longer emission reduction strategies. And ultimately, at AFF, we see carbon markets as an effective and needed conservation finance tool to support private landowners in improving the health of their forests.
Thanks, Natalie. That's a super helpful background. And one of the things that you mentioned, well, just talking about forests as carbon sinks, understanding where we are against, again, that concept of baseline and understanding that things could double. We could be doubling the amount of carbon that we're sequestering with our American forests. It's a really big deal. And I think good news for folks who are looking at climate action and want to take steps immediately. But the other thing that you mentioned is the voluntary component of all of this. CRES Forum, we favor voluntary mechanisms and empowering individual businesses and landowners to make the best decisions possible for them. So that's certainly something that is attractive. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about now. Bill and Rick, I'll prompt you with the next question here. I mentioned Growing Climate Solutions Act as a potential model for elevating voluntary carbon markets. And maybe we can get into it a little bit in terms of where you all see some of the specific opportunities, maybe not with this specific bill, but with carbon capture or soil sequestration, whatever it is, because I think what Natalie mentioned is that there are certain land practices that are sources, there are certain land practices that are sinks. And when we're talking about carbon offsets, oftentimes we're talking about making that switch, and maybe that's moving lands that were marginally productive for the crop that a farmer is producing and switching to something else. Bill, you talked earlier about just land, additional cover crops to help increase soil sequestration. Forestry is always an option, but farmers are in the business of farming usually, and not in the business of planting trees on what could otherwise be productive land. But Growing Climate Solutions and some of these other voluntary carbon markets also look at methane capture. That might be an opportunity. And so I'd just like to turn it over to you both and see if you can talk for a little bit about what are some of the projects that you've seen? What are some of the successes you've seen in terms of capturing carbon and either avoiding that emission or sequestering it on some of the farms that you all have been working on?
Yeah, certainly. I think, and Rick will be able to help, I think, a little bit more. They've done a lot more in Pennsylvania around livestock manure management because of concerns about P&K and the Chesapeake and biodigesters and those kinds of opportunities as well. And as I think, and Natalie was talking, I think there really are no farms that I know that don't have some trees. Sometimes it's a woodlot. Sometimes we don't all have perfect ground. We have other ground that we need to be able to do some things with. And if we can figure out that there's some of that land that can do some other things, there could be value. So I think being able to help us understand what the value is carbon-wise to different activity out there. So we need to understand how much do we sequester with no-till and cover crops, and different types of cover crops do it differently. One of the things the bill does is provide look at providing more science so that we can understand it. Maybe science that we can agree on. There's certainly several different folks out there in the private market right now. They come to different conclusions about what different practices do. I think one of the other things that Rick mentioned, and he can talk about it, is these folks that have already made changes. How do we help with that question around additionality? Maybe government can be supportive of those that have made changes. For the most part, the folks in Iowa that have switched to cover crops and no-till and done some things that are carbon friendly didn't do it because of carbon. They did it because of water, or they did it because they wanted to improve their soil quality. They're not interested in going back, but they're certainly not interested in looking across the fence and feeling like they're left out either. So how do we figure out those pieces? They all have more that they can do, and they need help to understand what the value is of those other things that they can do too.
Yeah, I'd have to say, Bill, that's it. We've done a lot of different things, cover crops. I know guys that have put methane digesters in with, federal grants and that to help with that. One of the big areas I think we really need to start to understand is like where our best baselines are, what crops actually do what. Does a rye crop sequester more carbon than a triticale crop for a cover crop? There's a lot of questions there of, what practices best meet the needs of sequestering the most carbon. And I think as we evolve and understand those technologies and, we can better serve, the community in doing the best job we can. You'd think as advanced as we are in a lot of our technologies, there's just so much more to learn of what we're doing. I know one thing, just even with cattle production, most people, think of the emissions from cattle. True, there are emissions from cattle, but when you think of the dairy herd in the United States today, we're talking 9 million cows, a little over 9.5 million cows in the dairy herd. Most people don't realize in the 30s, there was 27 million dairy cows. So our productivity on the farm has increased so much with less resources than what we're using. We have a third less dairy cows in the US compared to the 30s, but look at our productivity and, how well we manage our resources. There's been so much improvement in technology.
Huh. Yeah, Rick, that's an impressive, and I think an important thing to think about. We think about, like, or at least I do in the energy world, energy efficiency, but I think many Americans don't think about that on-farm productivity as much as we maybe should. So coming away from that dialogue right there, you both talked about the science and an important role for government to help provide some insight in terms of where USDA extension services being available to help farmers navigate what is if you're looking to optimize from carbon, what is going to be the math behind that. But also about that certainty, and there is a question, related to that that I'll bring up later. But Natalie, I do want to switch over to you and ask you one question. You mentioned very briefly the Rural Forest Market Act in your intro. The conversation with Bill and Rick, there's some complexity here, right? Carbon markets and natural climate solutions are a bit complex. Can you talk a little bit about how that bill would assist and provide some support for either family foresters or private sector folks that are interested in this space?
Yes, thanks for asking this question, Charles. You are right. Carbon markets are complex, as Richard and Bill pointed out. And while carbon markets sound like a simple solution to both helping address climate change and supporting family forest owners financially, the fact of the matter is small forest owners have not been able to access these carbon markets so far. In fact, less than 1% of acres in existing carbon projects are on acreages between 20 and 1,000 acres. And this is the size range of the majority of family-owned properties in the US. And this is due to several reasons. The first is complexity and a lack of knowledge of how these programs operate. The second is the high upfront costs needed to enter programs and have the carbon on the property measured is extremely expensive. And then the third is really the lengthy contract period. Most traditional programs require 100+ years or more. And for most landowners, terms under those circumstances that last for multiple generations aren't attractive. And again, this does not mean that carbon markets aren't a viable solution. It means that we need to develop workable solutions to address these barriers to landowner participation in carbon markets, which we at the American Forest Foundation, along with the Nature Conservancy, have been doing. We have created a credible private sector program for partnering with family forest owners that produce verifiable carbon sequestration and storage. That program is called the Family Forest Carbon Program. It empowers America's rural family forest owners to manage their forests smarter in ways that sequester more carbon. And more specifically, how the program works is we pay family forest owners to implement climate smart forest management practices that result in additional carbon sequestered and stored on the landscape. Additionally, we help the landowners connect with a professional forester and transition to long-term sustainable forest management. Beyond sequestering and storing more carbon, the program also engages landowners in better managing their forests. However, our program is not just helping to overcome the unique challenges for small family forest owners, but we are also working to advance the integrity of carbon credits. With the creation of a new methodology to measure carbon, and this is set to be approved by Verra's Verified Carbon Standard, also known as VCS, later this year. And so, our program is designed, as I said, we pay landowners upfront to implement these practices that will then generate carbon. So it will be some time before we will have the sales from the carbon credits that we can use to support and pay the landowners. And what programs like ours need and others similar is upfront capital to expand and enroll more of these landowners. And so we have interest from investors, but we would have more interest if there was less risk on their end. And this is where the Rural Forest Markets Act comes in, introduced by Senators Stabenow and Braun. This bipartisan bill will provide loan or bond guarantees to investors for investment in carbon market projects for small and family forest owners. And right now, USDA already issues guarantees for traditional agricultural markets. And this would expand authorities to non-traditional markets like carbon and water markets. And additionally, the guarantee would provide private investors the assurance they need to confidently invest in new or less traditional programs like the Family Forest Carbon Program or others similar to help catalyze more private investment in forests.
Thanks, Natalie. That's a great answer and super insightful. Talking about that certainty, those relative risks for the producers, for the forest, the folks that are on the forestry side is one part of it. On the other side of the equation, folks that are demanding these carbon offsets, and I mentioned at the very beginning, the likely exponential growth and the need for offsets, and there's going to be some risk tolerance that folks are comfortable with, and some risk tolerance that folks aren't comfortable with. And it's these voluntary carbon markets are markets just like any other. Just to digress for a second, my air conditioner broke last night. And so this morning, the air condition repair guy, was telling me about his Dogecoin investment and his AMC investments that he was really hot on. And I was like, I got two little girls, two older girls. Like my risk appetite might be a little bit less than his. But we're all investing, we're all looking to markets to be able to make transactions, to put food on the table, to invest or to sequester and offset carbon. But there is the issue of permanence, and I think that when folks are looking to make these carbon offsets, and I do want to ask one of the questions that we got in the chat already, and I will remind folks that if you do have questions, please drop them in the chat and we can cycle them in here. But one of the questions is roughly how many of the ag solutions are permanent, or how do we view kind of permanent carbon sequestration on the farm or in forests? And for me, I think back to the soil science building at the University of Minnesota, where they showed the root systems of, different of corn versus alfalfa versus soy, and it is very impressive. And there's probably some level of permanence that you can infer from just maybe the root structure of what you're growing. But I don't know if Natalie, Bill, or Rick, you want to jump in and talk about that issue of permanence and kind of this life cycle approach when we're talking about carbon on the farm or in the forest.
Bill, you want to go first?
Sure, either way here. So one of those things that often a lot of the conversation right now is about soil and that opportunity with soil. And that is an important conversation, and that has a permanence question. In some cases, in fact, I talked to somebody the other day who was measuring different types of carbon and said it's not just how much carbon there is, it's what type it is, because different types will have different permanence, and therefore they were much more sophisticated than I in understanding that. But we also have other pieces. We talked a little bit about biodigesters or other practices. Let's say I change my fertilizer practice and use a lower carbon a fertilizer on that farm. If I do, or if I bury the manure and use it in a way that I don't release gas, that's permanent. I mean, that is something that was not released. It's not right like soil that can be released. And so there's absolute permanence. There's other levels of permanence that we still need to figure out. And I think that's one of the reasons for an act to be able to help us come up with a science that measures that and figures out quick ways to measure. And then I think both Natalie and Rick mentioned too, and just in your example, Charles, everyone's different. Every farm is different. Every operation is different. Frankly, soil on the same farm is different. And so we need to figure out how it works in Rick's farm and the farm across the fence. And there's different soils. We have folks that are out there with different tools. There's a non-dairy farm across the fence that is looking for raising different crops. And so we need lots of solutions so that they work for different folks out there too. And I think those will help us. Now that's beyond the permanence question, but I will leave it to Rick or Natalie to answer more of that.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, Bill. Yeah, I'd have to say, I guess talking about permanence, I guess as we understand the carbon markets and how we can sequester carbon, I think you just build upon the baseline that we started. All these conservation practices that we've done over the years, we keep building upon those. We've started with cover crop or, no-till, buffer strips, contour strips, like on my farm, because I've got hills, I do contour stripping to prevent erosion, and I think as we understand the market and the technology, the permanence will just continue to build. We'll just keep growing, that market and understanding those markets. And, like Bill said, something that might work on my farm might not work in Iowa. But as we understand and do research, I mean, that's, part of the solution is to make sure we have funding for research through the universities and land grants and private investment in research.
Thanks, Rick. That's helpful. Yeah, relying on the science is going to be a critical, part to all of this. Natalie, do you want to jump in on the subject of permanence?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can speak to this in relation to our Family Forest Carbon Program. We offer contracts depending on the practice. Currently, we offer a 10-year contract and a 20-year contract for our enrolled landowners in Pennsylvania. And it is under VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard Guidance. Our program commits to maintaining a 100-year permanence for the carbon we've stored. And we do this through several ways. And one of these ways is through VCS guidance by setting aside a portion of revenues from credit sales into a permanence fund. And there, the permanence fund will conduct long-term monitoring of project performance beyond the crediting period, and will also invest in stewardship networks to support landowners in the region. And furthermore, we can really help keep permanence by transitioning landowners to long-term management. This way, the carbon forests stay as forests and healthy.
Thanks, Natalie. And I'll encourage attendees here to drop in any questions that you do have in the chat. Those pop up and I'll be able to ask them. I want to shift a little bit and talk about brokers and folks that are helping to make these carbon markets work, make these transactions possible. I think of Gordon Gekko and Wall Street and the Wolf of Wall Street when I think about it. That's why I'm an E-Trade guy and I just do the trades myself, and I don't want to make somebody else too rich in the process. But when it comes to voluntary carbon markets, there are brokers too. And Bill, you're a consultant. I'm a former consultant. Like, there's a good role for brokers and consultants in this space. Could any of you talk a little bit about the brokers in terms of what they're, because I think there is valid concern that there could be that the benefit of engaging in the carbon market won't be to the farmer or won't be to the landowner or the forester, and that the money will flow to brokers. I know that there are some provisions in Growing Climate Solutions to help address that, to help deal with kind of the, I don't want to say insider trading, but that really the benefit flow to the landowner and to real Americans who are out there working the land. Could any of you talk a little bit about that process and who those players are?
Rick and I both look at each other here. So absolutely, I think there is a role for consultants. I'm not buying any carbon here, but I think you're right. There's a rush of folks to buy or to participate in this. I think everybody's trying to figure out what it's going to look like, and I think maybe Natalie mentioned early on too. There's a cost to this that impacts scale. So if it costs $5,000 to do this, and you're only buying $6,000 worth of credits, it's not necessarily the brokers making money, but somebody's getting paid to figure out what that cost is. And so being able to find more efficient ways to measure, either by modeling or maybe in farming, it's by having some sensors on our farm equipment as we go across the field to be able to figure out what's out there. Other ways of being able to decrease that cost of verification is going to be hugely important. And then, as you say, it's a market. Right now, a lot of stuff is talked about as $15 a ton for kind of the soil markets. I would argue it should be worth more than that if it's real permanent. If it's stuff that's not happening. If it's questionable and we're trying to figure out permanence, maybe that's the right amount for now. But I do think that there is a real opportunity for that value to grow over time too. And so I'm encouraging folks. Train hasn't left the station. There's a lot of things that we have to figure out yet. Certainly get engaged, because I believe this is real. This is going to be something we're still talking about 15 and 50 years from now. And we're going to figure some things out in all of it. So don't pretend like it's just the flavor of the month. It really is something that's going to be there, but it's also not all figured out yet. So get engaged, figure that out. Maybe talk to some of those brokers, figure out what they're asking for. But you don't have to jump at them, because it's not going to go away, and this isn't going to be your last chance to sell carbon to somebody who drives up your driveway.
Rick or Natalie, do you want to jump in on that in terms of brokers and the role for third parties here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd have to say, the first thing that comes to my mind when you talk brokers and that is, the contractors and consulting and verification of all of this. We have to make sure, I think the Climate Solutions Act is, with the advisory role that it has in there, will help with that on making sure that, contracts are, good legal documents that, don't put the farmers at risk, don't put the investors at risk. Let's understand all the pieces on both sides of it. And with the, the verification, have advisory groups to understand what needs verified and making sure that, what's being presented is factual out there and not just pie in the sky stuff that, either can't be met or, is so unattainable and it's not sustainable for the farmer either. So there is a lot of questions there that need to be answered. And, the Solutions Act will help answer some of those questions and put those pieces together.
Thanks. Thanks, Rick. Natalie, do you have anything to add on that or?
Yeah, and I would just add really quickly, that with so many programs popping up, the best way for a landowner or, really anyone to know who to trust is to enroll in a program that have approved methodologies, through one of the widely accepted carbon standards, such as the Verified Carbon Standard, the Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry, and there are others. Really these standards ensure a project is transparent and uses a realistic approach and baseline for calculating the carbon benefit.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. That's great. And I think something all of you mentioned is this process of verification. And Bill, while you were talking about, the different maybe qualities of offsets too, that's something that the Bloomberg article that I read yesterday was talking about, that not all carbon offsets are going to be equal in the same way that when you're shopping at the grocery store, not all the produce is equal. The organic stuff commands a higher price. The locally sourced, products command a different price, and sometimes it's cheaper to buy local, sometimes it's more expensive. And I think that that's something that we're going to begin to understand as offsets become more common, as the market grows and becomes more robust. I think that folks are familiar that, you can click a button and then you offset your flight, but you don't know where that offset, took place. But as companies are making their portfolios, there's so many companies, it seems every day I open up the newspaper and there's another corporation that is pledging to get to 100% net zero, and they're doing what they can to produce renewable power. So much of that is going to need to come, from offsets. And that if part of their corporate storytelling is that we engaged with American farmers or American, land managers who are managing forests or rangelands, and that these are high quality offsets that we're purchasing, I think that's going to matter, and I think it's going to command a different kind of price. And I think that's going to be a good thing for the market to figure out as things evolve. So I think, Bill, your comment that it's not done, we're really at the beginning, is a very encouraging thing. And at least in my mind, what I've seen evolve when I first started tracking carbon markets and land-based offsets, 15 years ago, it was hard. It still is hard to measure soil carbon, but that folks can take a picture, that satellite imagery can help better understand what's happening in real time on the land, provides those verifiers a lot more visibility into what's going on. Let me click here. I think there's
maybe
another...
Charles.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Let me pop in there just a second. Add one more layer of complexity, right? I think Natalie mentioned it, and certainly that's true of Chesapeake Bay. This isn't the only thing we care about. We care about water quality, water quantity in some parts of the country as well, biodiversity, other pieces. I believe those will all have an opportunity to develop some credits as well, whether they're true markets like we sell biodiversity credits or not. I don't know, but at least we'll want timber from areas that care about those other things, not just carbon. We will want dairy that care about those other characteristics too. So we have to figure out not only the difference in carbon in timber and cropland, but we have to figure out how the impact is different and how it matches. And frankly, you may care more about water quality than somebody in the West cares about water quality, because you're in Annapolis and care about the Bay, Charles, and somebody there may say, I'm willing to pay a significant amount for carbon and water quantity out in the West. And so there may be differences in the kinds of markets out there and the combinations.
That's a good point, Bill, and gets us back to that idea of co-benefits and what we're paying for in any given transaction. I'm going to bundle together two questions that have popped up. I'll encourage folks to keep asking questions, but with an eye on the clock, I want to bundle these two, which is, what technology currently exists for small-scale farmers and foresters to measure or verify carbon sequestration, and what are the associated costs? The other part of the question is, who are the main players in brokerage? And so maybe this is a chance to, if they're not name names, and if there are some folks that that are working in this space or good technologies that are helping. And then I'll add to that. So this is a fully packaged question. We've talked about growing climate solutions and rural forest markets. They're different bills. Do we need them both? I don't know if that's a yes/no question. So I've packed a lot in there, but I do want to offer one last chance to go around the horn here. If folks want to talk about, technology that exists for this verification, like really on the ground, and who's actually doing it.
And I think of one pieces of technology in ag, and it probably is still more available to those on larger farms and newer equipment. Not mine. I got old equipment around, but we have folks that can track practices. So my John Deere will track your practices. There's ways to be able to input that into some of these suppliers, and they can tell you that you were no-till. And so you don't have to go out and check a box, and you can figure out what part of the field you seeded with cover crops and how much of it and when it was.
There's an app for that. That's what you're saying.
Well, yeah, Deere is working with many of these suppliers to be able to make it easy for those suppliers. Again, that information's the farmers. The farmers need to be able to say, I want that to happen, and here's who I want to share that with. But it would at least reduce the amount of paperwork that a farmer has to go through.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, I'll just have to say, I'm not sure with the actual carbon sequestration, but like sort of on Bill's technology. I mean, there's a lot of variable weight equipment out there that's GPS driven, that that's data the farm has, that as he's changing soil types through the field, the planter's making different planting rates or fertilizer rates, and even crop protection rates. There is a lot of soil mapping going on, so there is a tremendous amount of data out there. Probably maybe more in the Midwest than what there is in the Northeast, because some of that technology is pretty expensive. It's harder for a small farmer to implement on. I still run old equipment too, so and that's it. That type of technology is sort of out of my reach a little bit yet at this point, but.
Okay.
Great, and I will just add on, I know this is a two-parter question, so I have two answers. In terms of science and data, I do want to emphasize the U.S. Forest Service forest inventory and analysis data sets every year. So yearly, we, AFF, for our Family Forest Carbon Program, we rerun our baseline data off of FIA data, and we are capturing real observed measurements, and we'll recalculate our baseline data every year measurements are conducted. So we're not only relying on a 100-year growth and yielding model, and and if there would be a shift in forest markets, all will not only show up in project plot, but baseline as well. So our carbon is extremely accurate. So just wanted to kind of hammer home the importance of, the forest inventory and analysis data for forest carbon projects. And then additionally to your question around, do we need both the Growing Climate Solutions Act and the Rural Forest Markets Act? Yes, absolutely. We feel both bills are needed because they support landowners at different points in their journey to participating in carbon markets. The Growing Climate Solutions Act is important as it provides guidance and technical support for landowners to be able to enroll in these carbon programs, but that is based on the programs and practices that currently exist, which are limited to the landowners they support. And as I mentioned, there are very few programs that are accessible to small family forest owners, the majority being the majority of landowners in our country. And that is why the Rural Forest Markets Act would help to catalyze more carbon projects for these landowners by de-risking that upfront capital needed to stimulate these projects.
Thanks, Natalie. That's super helpful. And thanks to you, Bill and Rick, for participating in this conversation. I've got an eye on the clock, and I want to be able to wrap up just a little bit before the hour. We live in this world of back-to-back team and Zoom meetings. But I'm very impressed by this conversation, and I know we could go a lot longer. I will encourage folks to be in touch with each of you if they have follow-on questions. CRES, we're certainly happy to act as a broker and to get folks connected to you if there are additional questions. But what impressed me here is that we talked a lot about science. We talked a lot about the land. And if we all have some old equipment, there's some new equipment too, and really that new high-tech frontier is going to help answer a lot of the questions that we have about uncertainty and be able to de-risk. But it's going to require some money, and that's where these voluntary carbon markets might be able to help bridge that gap and really deliver some of these co-benefits that we're talking about in terms of carbon to what folks are doing with their existing land management practices or additional land management practices that they want to undertake. Seems like there's a lot of opportunity, but another key point that I heard from you all is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And indeed, that's why the voluntary nature of all of this is important, to work from the bottom up so that we can lead with the farmer's interests, lead with the land manager's interests first, and so that he or she can choose and make those decisions that are going to be best for their land, their family, and their community for the years ahead. So this is super informative. Thanks to you all. I really appreciate this conversation. For me personally, as someone who's been working in this for a long time, it's fantastic to see these bills really moving to the front of the charts, to see such bipartisan support for something that has the word climate in it. It's a pretty big deal and not to be understated. So thanks to each of you for participating here and to our attendees for joining. So with that, I'll sign off and say thanks to you all.